I absolutely share your concern. I think what we are seeing from the new authorities in charge in Damascus and their affiliated groups is very worrisome. We are seeing continued use of violence against the groups you have mentioned, the Alawites, the Druze, and now the Kurds, in order to push their agenda, namely to unify the country under their rule. And I think that is highly problematic. Unfortunately, the reactions of the international community have been lukewarm at best. What we have seen is statements of concern. We have seen the French embassy issuing strong condemnation of the violence in Aleppo, but there is no willingness to really hold the authorities in Damascus and ultimately President al-Shara accountable for what is happening. And that's really problematic. That's also why we see the pattern continue. We saw it with the Alawites, we saw it with the Druze, now we see it with the Kurds, because the government in Damascus is not being held accountable and pushed to find a political solution to the issues in Syria. There absolutely is. I think your point is very important. These are militias, but they are militias that somehow work with the government in Damascus. This is important because the same argument was used in Sueda in July last year. The argument was, oh, these are Bedouin fighters that are attacking Sueda. Yes, but these were Bedouin fighters that were loyal to the HTS government in Damascus, right? And I think here we see the same. We are seeing militias. Yes, they are not directly Syrian army, but they are loyal to the Damascus authorities. And this is what, in my opinion, is so problematic. This is where it is very hard for the international community to hold these militias accountable. But the international community, especially the Americans and the Europeans, can hold the government in Damascus accountable and can ask the government in Damascus to make sure that violence is not used anymore. I really believe we need to have a transition process that is much more inclusive, that represents the different groups, the different components of the country. And I think we need to move to a system where the rights of all groups are protected. The Kurds, the Alawites, the Druze, but also the Assyrians and many other smaller communities who either have been oppressed in the past or they have been used by the Assad regime to justify its rule. Now really is a chance to build a more inclusive Syria. And unfortunately, what we are seeing in Aleppo, what we saw in Sueda and in Latakia and the coastal regions, means it's slipping away. The chance to build an inclusive, democratic, decentralized Syria seems to be really slipping away. And I'm afraid the alternative will be more violence. I think ultimately this question is not for me to answer, but more for Kurdish leaders. I think talking about federalism and decentralization makes a lot of sense because it can give rights to the different groups in Syria, while at the same time, it can also keep Syrian unity, Syrian territorial integrity, which seems to be very important to HTS and, of course, also to Syria's neighboring countries and the international community. Whatever the future system will be, I think what is important is that it is agreed upon by all components. That means not having one Kurdish minister or one Christian minister. It means really speaking with representatives of the groups that are elected by the groups and say, we want to include you in the transition and we are taking your perspective seriously. And let's find a compromise to build a state that includes all of us. It seems to me that it must really be the responsibility of the Damascus government to disarm these militia. Rather than focusing so much on using violence against the Alawites, Druze, and Kurds, I would much rather see the Damascus government focusing on either integrating these militia in the Syrian army or disarming them. I mean, President al-Shara keeps talking about how the state needs to be the only legitimate holder of the monopoly of force, of weapons, and of instruments of violence. And I agree with him on that. but he uses that argument against the SDF, against the Kurds, against Druze militia. He's not using it against the Bedouin. He's not using it against the militia we are now seeing fighting Kurdish fighters in Aleppo. So there's really two different measures here that Damascus uses. And for me, the responsibility lies with Damascus. Integrate these violent factions, disarm them or integrate them, but hold them accountable and make sure these outbreaks of violence that keep happening again and again every 6 months since the transition, they stop and a real political dialogue can start.